I don't want to get in trouble for copyright infringement, but I can let that play in the background, I suppose. One of the texts that we have for today is Aristotle on tragedy. Just basically the difference between tragedy and comedy, which for Aristotle are the two types of plots. The tragedy is when the hero of the story does everything correctly and yet still suffers in the end and dies, usually, right? That way. I guess the most famous would be the Oedipus series with of course Oedipus being informed that fate had it out for him to kill his father and wed his mother, etc. And he promised himself he would never do that, and of course everything in that occurs exactly the way predicted. And of course he pulls his eyes out in horror at what he had done, etc. So he did everything right, and yet at the end, fate still screws him over. And certainly the point of tragedy for the Greeks was to recognize that life will eventually destroy us. We die in the end. Basically, life sucks, if you want to put it that way. And there's nothing you could do about it. You could do everything right, and yet you'll still be screwed in the end. So, and the advantage of having a community all sharing a performance, and the plays were actually a religious event for them, and they were mandatory. It wasn't like, maybe I'll go to the show tonight. No, you actually had to be there. Often, and the goal of it was for the whole community to suffer together, because that catharsis of suffering together literally helps keep the community together, right? So everyone's on the same sheet of music because they're suffering together. And by the way, it's very easy to think of the Mass, the Christian Mass, the Catholic Mass, as a narrative, basically, the suffering of Jesus reenacted each Sunday, or however often. I remember in high school, the monastery had, where the teachers lived, had a basement with rows of altars on. They were just like little kubies, where you could go down. The priests could all go down and say Mass whenever they wanted, and high school students like me got to be older boys, so we could go and assist whoever asked us to go. By the way, if you go, you see like cathedrals in Europe, like not just in Europe, but in even the United States. If you look at the cathedral layout, there's a main altar, of course, but all around the perimeter of the cathedrals, including even in the basements usually, are other altars dedicated to different individuals. So the Washington, D.C., or the Catholic University Cathedral, it's not really in Washington, D.C., it's in Maryland, but right across the border, is dedicated to the Blessed Mother, and there are 52 altars in that one cathedral, each dedicated to a different appearance of the Blessed Mother. Even though Notre Dame burned if you look around in Orléans, which is the way the French, I guess, pronounce Orleans, as we pronounce it New Orleans, right? Well, the French obviously don't say all their consonants, so you have Orléans. The cathedral looks almost exactly like Notre Dame, our mother, right? So if you visit there ever, notice all around the periphery are rows of altars, all dedicated to different things. Not all to the Blessed Mother, not all to Joan of Arc, of course, although there are some main features of the cathedral and even the town, of course, because Joan was considered to be the Maid of Orléans, not because she was from there, but because that was the city that she had to conquer in order for the Dauphin to be crowned king, etc. of France. This, of course, I guess you saw, is a silent film of Joan of Arc, and the music, notice the silent film, of course, even the dialogue is on the screen in text. It's titled Voices of Light, I believe, and the music is written later, of course, but it's Richard Einhorn's Voices of Light, which is meant to be played along with the showing of the movie. You're familiar with how things of that sort went. And I certainly think of the story of Joan as a tragedy, because she does everything right according to her voices. Even she is baffled by how things come out in the end, because of course she's done everything the voices told her. At one point, notice that the inquisitors have her confused enough that she even begins to doubt her own voices are the voices of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and not perhaps demons that have misled her. So it's certainly tragic, of course, and as the end result, of course, she's burned at the stake. So this is a tragedy. I think it fits the characteristics that Aristotle lays out. What's interesting is that what say, for example, Shakespeare writes and calls tragedies don't fit that category. Aristotle's plays, so of course, some are history plays, which just basically carry out the history. The comedies we should talk about as well, but the tragedies essentially are not tragic according to the Greek outline of how a tragedy should occur. Instead, they are, again, descriptions of things that happen, although the things that happen are sad. For example, Hamlet, we would certainly call it a tragedy, and yet if you look at what happens there, it's clearly not the case that Hamlet does everything right. So it's not, strictly speaking, a tragedy, and yet, of course, we think of it as tragic. When we look at American movies today, contemporary American movies, do we have any tragedies? So remember, the quiz question I have for you is, what's your favorite tragedy? And I mean not real tragedy, of course, like 9/11 or anything of that sort, but I'm thinking in terms of a drama of some sort, a movie, a play, whatever. What do you think of as a tragedy? And what's interesting, of course, is even in those movies, for example, that have tragic parts, they usually end well for the hero. Harry Potter comes back, right? He beats the enemy. So if we think of the monomyth, the story that Joseph Campbell outlines, Luke Skywalker defeats the enemy, right? If you think of how those stories go, even though there are tragic elements to it, in the sense that they're sad, the good guys die. Han Solo being killed by his own son, for example. That's certainly a tragic thing, but the story in its outline doesn't fit the classification that Aristotle gives it. Comedies, on the other hand, are when the hero, you wouldn't even call it the main character the hero, he does everything wrong. Or she does everything wrong. I don't know of any actually where it's the she that does everything wrong. But I think of course, Inspector Clouseau, the Pink Panther, some of those incredible occasions, where he does everything wrong and yet everything works out perfectly for him. It's just absolutely hilarious. Even for characters like his boss in the movie. They go nuts actually laughing at the ridiculousness of the whole thing. So, that's a beautiful production. But we're also looking at Schopenhauer again today. This is our second visit with Schopenhauer. But in this particular text, he's talking about how art takes away the mist. And by mist, what he's referring to is the blur, so to speak, of life. Everything just seems to be a blur. Well, where is the meaning in it? It's very hard to see. Just if you think of a morning misty day and you're looking at a cathedral, you could probably not see the full cathedral because of the mist. You might only be able to see the bottom of it and so on. So what's the meaning of the whole thing? You might not be able to tell, but art itself, he thinks, takes away that mist by giving us a sense of the meaning of things. But of course, the interesting part of that is that art is not an absolute clear explanation of the meaning of things. It's instead an intuitive feeling that we get from the art. Even art such as the lawn ornament here at the Arts Building gives you a sense, an intuitive sense of what it's there for. Of course, we all get a different type of interpretation of it, depending on our own, what we ourselves bring to the experience of the art, right? So, to me, watching Einhorn's music or listening to Einhorn's music, even without the movie being shown at the same time, and I used to have to try to pull up a YouTube video of the movie and then at the same time try to play the CD of Einhorn's music and you're always wondering, are they lined up? How would you know? Because obviously there's a script for how the music is supposed to play with what's going on the screen. So you never could arrange that yourself, but obviously in this particular video you have the conductor leading the orchestra and the choir along with the movie, so you know it's at exactly when it's supposed to occur. But when you're listening to that, to me it might mean something absolutely tragic, but to folks that are not maybe that interested in Joan of Arc or not familiar with the history or whatever, it might be just, well, boring music perhaps, or boring video, because after all it is an old black and white silent film, which lasts over an hour, right? So how many folks today can spend that much of their attention just watching something like that? Not sure. But so obviously the cathartic experience of seeing something like that would be different depending on, of course, your own subjective point of view. I also have, I think this is really the first introduction to Martha Nussbaum. And I'll play some of this so you can...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning.